To talk about the changes to the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act of 2022.
Yes.
And joining me is Matilda Lloyd. So Matilda, I understand you've been doing a fair bit of research on the new Act. Where do we start?
Okay, well, let's start 2021. So that is when the new Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act was introduced and enacted, and that was to replace the existing Aboriginal Heritage Act. Now, the change was made based on the destruction of Juukan Gorge a number of years ago, and so the aim was to improve the legislation to recognise what Aboriginal cultural heritage is in Western Australia, to protect any harm to Aboriginal cultural heritage, and so to empower local knowledge holders as well.
Right. And there was an existing Aboriginal Heritage Act.
Yes, and it's still in force at the moment.
Yep.
That is the Aboriginal Heritage Act, and yeah, it's still in force until the 31st of July, and that still covers what Aboriginal cultural material is, what an Aboriginal site is, what activities can be done in an area that is declared an Aboriginal site or a protected area. It also covers what approvals and consent need to be sought if a landowner, for instance, wants to undertake an activity on their property where there is a known Aboriginal site or a protected area.
Yeah. Okay, so I understand the new Act is quite an extensive piece of legislation.
It is,
So
yes.
let's distill it down to a couple of key points.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think the first is a change to the definition of what Aboriginal heritage is.
Yes, that's correct. So the definition has changed, so it now captures tangible and intangible objects, places, that are of Aboriginal cultural heritage and significance. And so this captures, yes, Aboriginal places, cultural landscapes, it captures stories and songs. So it's really to extend the definition beyond an object or a specific place. And so to capture those other things actually make up Aboriginal cultural heritage. So it's definitely increased and broadened.
Right. And I think one of the other changes coming is what's known as a directory. And that sort of leads into my question to you. How do you find out whether you have Aboriginal heritage as it's going to be defined
Yes.
on your property?
So existing is a register of Aboriginal objects and places, and that can be found via the Department of Lands, Planning and Heritage on their website. And so that takes you to a map sort of program where you can drill down on certain areas of Western Australia where there is an Aboriginal heritage site, sorry, an Aboriginal site under registered, or whether there's a protected area registered, and it also has information about ILUAs, so Indigenous Land Use Agreements. The proposal under the new Act is that there's going to be a directory. It's going to be called the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Directory. It's essentially going to use the existing platform, which is the registrar, but include more extensive information. So it'll include protected areas and Aboriginal sites from the registrar, but it will also include any new Aboriginal cultural heritage that is surveyed, discovered, or potentially in existence within WA.
Yep.
It'll also have information about native title holders, knowledge holders, and a new local Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Service, which is to be established across the regions.
Okay. So conceptually the directory will be the font of all knowledge.
Yes.
But unfortunately it's not going to be, as we understand under the new tier system.
Exactly. Yeah. So when the government I suppose introduced the bill for this new Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act, they did express that obviously it's not going to be possible to capture every bit of history, information, record to do with Aboriginal cultural heritage, due to the fact that Indigenous people have been here for so long. They have so many different stories. It's impossible to capture everything.
Yeah.
So, but they've acknowledged that, and so the register is meant to be the most accurate reflection, as at this point in time. And the plan is it will also be updated and monitored by the local Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Services and also the committee and the council.
Yeah.
So it's really about updating that information so that if you are a landowner and you're curious or think you might have Aboriginal cultural heritage on your property, being able to go somewhere and determine whether you do or you don't.
Yeah. And so I mentioned the tier system.
Yes, yeah.
Can you describe that?
Yeah, so another introduction with the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act is the due diligence assessment process and the activity tiers. So if you'd like to undertake an activity on your land that may cause harm to Aboriginal cultural heritage, or undertake an activity on someone else's land that may cause there's a risk of harm to Aboriginal cultural heritage, there's what's known as a due diligence process to determine whether that there is Aboriginal cultural heritage on that land, and then determine if your activity will harm that Aboriginal cultural heritage. And so it's quite an involved process, the due diligence assessment, because it's based on tiers. So you have an activity tier that has exempt activities, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and those are have been determined according to the level of ground disturbance. So an exempt activity, very minimal ground disturbance. Tier 1 activities, there's low, tier 2 is moderate, and then obviously tier 3 is high.
Yeah. And we'll come to more detail on those through our 3-part series.
We will, because like I said, it is quite intricate, and the way the legislation has been structured and the code, those activities are broken down into different industries. So you have a specific one for agriculture and natural resource activities, you have one for waterways, you have one for mining. So it's really split according to industry, and then you have obviously the different levels of activities within that industry. Yeah.
And so, all right, well, what happens if you actually have Aboriginal heritage on your farmland under the existing Act?
So under the existing Act, if you discover or suspect that there is an Aboriginal site on your land or a protected area, then it's a case of going, okay, if you want to undertake an activity, you have to seek consent. But before that, you have to, if you're not sure if it is or isn't an Aboriginal site, you've actually got to report it. And so that involves reporting it to the Aboriginal Cultural Material Committee and also to police. They've actually put that in the legislation.
No. So I was talking about the old Act.
Oh, yes, sorry.
Act.
Yeah, the old Act.
So the current Act, that's in play until the end of June, I think?
July.
The end of July?
Yes.
If you've got Aboriginal heritage on your property,
yes,
it's a site or it's a
protected area.
What are your obligations?
So your obligations are to notify someone if it hasn't been, but if it's registered and it's on the current register, it will be on the directory. It's a case of going through the due diligence assessment based on the activity you want to undertake. Essentially, if you're going to if there's a risk of harm to Aboriginal cultural heritage with any sort of activity that you're undertaking, it's essentially if there's a risk that you're going to be committing a crime under the new Act.
No, old Act.
Old Act.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so under the old Act, if you have a registered site on your property, you want to undertake an activity, you need the consent of the minister?
Yeah, the register of the minister, and then it's up to their discretion as to whether or not you can carry that activity.
Yeah. And so when we flip into the new Act,
yes,
we have this tier system and the due diligence obligations.
Yes, that's correct.
Right.
So essentially it's based around the activities, and your activities determine what you have to do within that due diligence assessment. So if it's a tier 1 activity, the first step is doing a search on the directory. The second is doing a visual inspection, and that's kind of the first steps of determining whether you have Aboriginal cultural heritage on your property. From there, it's a case of if you do, then it's consulting with local landowners, it's consulting with your local Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Service or your native title holders. If you don't, then essentially you are allowed to carry on because you've undertaken the first 2 steps in that tier 1 activity. But remember, this is low ground disturbance, and you have to determine whether your activity fits into this first tier before you undertake that.
And I guess, as I said earlier, we'll leave the detail of the tier system to one of our 3-part series because it's quite complex, convoluted, and I think lacking definition. And there's a great deal of ambiguity in the guidelines and regulations that the government has released.
And I think we should premise that. So there's the new Act, there's a code, there's guidelines, and there's multiple documents that make those guidelines for understanding this new legislation. So it's not just referring to one document to get your information, it's referring to a whole collection of documents that tells you how to interpret things, who you have to contact, how to carry out these processes. Hence why it's taken, it's very complicated to understand.
Yeah.
But that's also why we're trying to explain it as best we can.
Yeah. So I think we got 2 penalties, Matilda.
Yes, that's
The
correct.
penalties under the existing Act.
Yes, yeah.
Can you tell us what they are?
Yeah, so they're divided into serious harm and then just harm to Aboriginal heritage. And so they're again broken up into individuals and body corporates. And kind of the max is about $50,000 as a fine, but there's also imprisonment as well.
Right, okay. And flipping to the new Act and the new regime, what's the penalty system look like?
We've got a large increase. Again, it's broken up. So you've got your material harm, serious harm, and then also harm caused by accident. And the penalties have increased substantially. So for a body corporate, the maximum penalty is $10 million.
Right, and for an individual?
For an individual, I think it is, like for serious harm, it can be $1 million.
Okay.
And there's also imprisonment.
Right, and can a director as well as a company be prosecuted?
Yes, if they're found to, if their activities have contributed to that harm, then yes.
Right. So we've gone from a penalty regime of $50,000 applicable to a corporate to $10 million. When we take the Sentencing Act provisions into account, you multiply that by 5. That's potentially $50 million for a corporate and $5 million for a director.
Huge.
Huge. How many farmers operate their business through a corporate entity?
Well, most of our clients do. These days you have a trust and you have a body, have a corporate as your corporate trustee.
Yeah.
You also might just farm as a company. I mean, that's the way forward to diversify the farm, to capture, sons returning. So yeah, it's very popular, and so you're going to be exposed, to that sort of penalty. In this instance. Yeah,
and it's not based upon the owner of the land; it's based upon the person who's undertaken the activity.
Yes, I mean it's directed the way it's described in the legislation. It is looking at landowners, but it's proponents, so the person undertaking the activity, and that onus is on them to undertake the due diligence assessment to determine what sort of tier they fit into in the activity tier system. So there's a lot of onus on the landowner and the proponent who's undertaking these activities to actually undertake that assessment.
Okay, so some very substantive big changes coming.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. Okay, and we'll deal with the substance of 3 of those.
Yes, so we'll
in our 3-part series.
Yes.
So what are those 3 going to be?
So as we mentioned, there's the due diligence assessment, and that's for each of the activities within the activity tier. So we'll look at the due diligence assessment broadly and then go in depth into each of those tiers, and specifically sort of what agricultural activities fit within those tiers. Right. We'll also be looking at, as I mentioned, about the local Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Services, which are a new addition to this legislation, as they will have a very large role to play in terms of management of Aboriginal cultural heritage, and also being involved in the due diligence assessment process as well.
Yeah. Okay, and that was the 3 of them?
Yes, yep. So due diligence, activity tiers, and the local Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Services.
Right, great. Thanks, Matilda. And thank you all.
So we'll be posting those videos up on our website and our Facebook pages and YouTube as well. So tune into that kind of in the coming days and weeks, and we'll have that available.
Yep, great. Thanks.